From California, the Institute of the Americas. Welcome. My name is Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. And here we are with another webinar. We're delighted to continue with the virtual discussions. And on this occasion, we're pleased to have our steering committee colleagues from Sproule joining us as part of a special presentation and webinar today that we've called Testing Resiliency, Latin America and the Caribbean Energy Outlook. And it is indeed on the occasion of Sproule's publication of their annual report assessing Latin America and the Caribbean's energy sector, looking a little bit back, and mainly looking forward as 2023 unfolds. Just a couple of quick housekeeping. We've organized the webinar into two halves. We definitely want to have some audience participation. So the first half will be a formal interventions and formal remarks, highlights and an overview of the report that Sproule has just published last week. And we'll also have our non-resident fellow, Carla Lacerda, who will offer some reflections and insights, both based upon the report and some of her perspectives. I'll paste the agenda here in a minute into the chat, just so everyone has that. But let's do something. Let's get everyone involved here. We want to try and get some audience participation. We've got a poll that we'll launch a little bit later. But let's go ahead and see if we can tee up a little bit on the audience participation side. And I'm curious, you know, on these virtual events, you can be joining from literally anywhere geographically. So why don't you put in the chat, everyone, if you want. You don't have to reveal where you're joining us from today, but it might be nice to see where we have our participants in the audience from today. So in the chat, if you want to just here, I'll actually kick it off here. So La Jolla, California, present, and just join us or post into the chat. And this was a great idea from our colleague at Sproule, Nicole Ronsky, sort of see where. Whoops! I posted that just to host and panelists. Let me try this again. So there we go. All right, so there's the idea. Let's see where folks are joining us from. You don't have to put exact city, you can put country, but let's see what we have today. Like I said, we'll also launch a poll that will be at the beginning of the Q&A, so stay tuned for that. And without any further ado, let me formally introduce Sproule, Representative Stace, their Senior Vice President for Corporate Development, Chris Milda, and their Regional Director for Latin America, Jorge Milanese. And Chris and Jorge, as I mentioned, will present and share highlights of their report. And following their formal presentation, we're pleased to have Carla Lacerda as our discussant. Carla will reflect upon the report and, as I mentioned, share some insights from the region. Delighted to have Carla here as a colleague at the Institute of the Americas for the last year plus. Carla joined our amazing roster of non-resident fellows at the beginning of last year after retiring from a distinguished career with ExxonMobil that included her final assignment as country chair of their operations of their presence in Brazil for ExxonMobil. So a Brazil expert, but also somebody with deep background in the sector, many years, and we look forward to having her. I think this is your first formal participation in the public setting with us, Carla. So great to have you on this as well, and look forward to your comments here in a minute. With that, Chris, I think I'll turn it over to you to get the formal presentation going. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Pleased to have you here today. Thank you, Chris.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy, for that introduction. And we're really grateful for the relationship and tremendous support from the full team at the Institute. Jorge and I are excited to share some of the highlights of the report with you today, and also to share some perspectives with Carla, who offers a deep view on the region and Brazil in particular, like you mentioned. Just to kick us off, and for those unfamiliar with Sproule, just a word on who we are for a bit of context. We're a global energy consulting and advisory firm, and what makes us a little bit different is really bringing that full technical, commercial, and operational expertise that we have in-house, which is really meant to help our clients provide a full view on risk and value across the energy value chain. We are active globally, but we have offices across the Americas, so Calgary, Denver, Houston, and Mexico City, and also our European hub in The Hague in the Netherlands. So to set the stage a bit more, this is the third year running we released this report, which provides an overview of activities across Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm going to let Jorge take us through some highlights by country in a bit. but I'm going to touch briefly on some key themes, which you see here from the report, and that underpin a lot of the developments in the region at different levels. So just to talk very briefly about each of these. Firstly, inflation's been elevated across Latin America and the Caribbean, emerging from the pandemic. I mean, this is a global phenomenon, but it is a challenge for the region as well in terms of impact on real income, purchasing power, and ultimately growth. But the region also has the resilience in its ability to deal with it, just given how it is not a new phenomenon in many countries, but it has had an impact, particularly in the smaller economies that have been relying more on imports. And some of that, of course, is also tied to the impact from supply chain disruptions. And there's a bigger story around the bifurcation of supply chains as well, as we enter what we might think of as a more fragmented next phase of globalization, and where Latin American countries position themselves in that. Some countries like Mexico should see this as a significant opportunity in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, with a greater focus on friendshoring and nearshoring, all those terms that we've come to be familiar with in the last couple of years. The energy transition has clearly arrived in Latin America, and although not unique to the region, policies haven't always necessarily followed targets set around net zero yet. However, many NOCs are also looking at creating different mandates. We're seeing this with Ecopetrol, for example, is a good one in Colombia. And we'll talk more about decarbonization efforts more broadly as well, specifically as it pertains to CCS and geothermal, which are both gaining some traction at different levels. Now, the Russia-Ukraine war has really seen a couple of stories play out. One is that Latin America is important from a global energy security perspective across multiple key commodities. And the other is that geopolitically, it's accelerating that fragmentation that I talked about of globalization. And the question is whether that's going to spur greater integration or fragmentation within the region as well. The story on gas is also evolving in LATAM, with some of the regional dynamics shifting, particularly with respect to Brazil and Argentina, both weaning themselves off Bolivian gas. And we're also seeing a new wave of potential LNG export facilities proposed, which again would require significant investment, but is obviously a key opportunity for the region, particularly when we talk about Argentina. Offshore exploration has yielded significant discoveries in Brazil, Mexico, Guyana, and Suriname. And when we look at the crude oil market, Brazil and Guyana are only two of a handful of countries globally that can really add anything meaningful to what is an otherwise pretty tight crude oil market in the coming years. And finally, to build on the decarbonization comments, the region has a significant opportunity as a resource powerhouse to play an important role in the transition, and will likely gain some further strategic importance in our view as a result. So as those new supply chains develop, the region will become increasingly important in terms of critical minerals. And thank you, Jorge, for pulling up this slide. This is just a bit of further background on M&A activity, which is a good proxy for broader activity in the market. It was clearly a long path to recovery from the pandemic in the region, but activity levels really kicked on in 2022. We were almost back to 2019 levels in terms of deal value, and crucially, Brazil came back in a major way with several major asset deals. And all of the number of transactions was down from 2021. Larger, more significant deals also demonstrated a strategic commitment from buyers, including EIG's acquisition of minority stake in Repsol's upstream business, which has a significant footprint in the region. And we also saw a growing opportunity set around gas, which was also reflected in deal activity, with 70% of deal value actually weighted towards gas. So with that, Jorge, I'm going to hand it over to you and let us get a quick tour country by country.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Chris. What we are proposing is to do a quick trip at very high level, just going swiftly from country to country. The full report has more than 40 slides, so certainly we are not going to do through all of them. So just some general comments. And let's start with Mexico, where in spite of the drawback of some political decisions there, the private companies have continued with a stream of development, notably ENI put on production an FPSO in Area 1 in the offshore. Pemex recently announced that they are going full steam ahead with the development of Block 7 Sama that has become very famous because of the election of the operator between Pemex and Talos, the company that discovered and proposed the development of the block. But that is going ahead, and I think it's a significant development, not only for Mexico, but for the region as well. Mexico also has taken several steps in order to increase the participation of natural gas in the energy matrix, and there are multiple plans for pipelines inside the country and connecting the US with Mexico, notably to the Pacific market, in order to do natural gas exporting via LNG there. Let's go on our travel south very briefly. We stop in Guatemala. The important thing here to remember is that there is a big run coming. Guatemala already has some oil production in several fields that are very well connected with a pipeline that finally leads to the export markets in the Gulf of Mexico coast. So this is a very important development for the country and for Central America as well. If we go to Venezuela, perhaps the major developments here have been conversations between Venezuela and Trinidad in order to start developing offshore gas in Venezuela in order to bring in that gas to the LNG facilities and to the petrochemical facilities in Trinidad that are lacking more natural gas production. And that seems to be going very well in several conversations. And there has been also some talks about exporting natural gas from Venezuela to Colombia that today is importing LNG. So those are the two, I would say, more significant developments. And there are some other things regarding natural gas that are at closed door under discussions. One of them is a notably amount of 2 BCS of flaring that is taking place in Venezuela today that eventually could be used in order to, reduce the carbon footprint on one hand, and also providing a new development opportunity for the country as well. Here we see one of the discussions between the Prime Minister of Trinidad and the President of Venezuela. And the picture below is also a very recent development in 2023, actually, that Chevron has restarted exporting crude oil from Venezuela to the US, to their refineries in Pascagoula, in Louisiana. If we go to the Caribbean, Barbados is progressing on bid rounds in the studies of the offshore. Shell started a partnership with BHP for a couple of blocks in the offshore, and there are plans in order to drill in the future. BHP conducted seismic acquisition. But Barbados is also famous in the Caribbean because of all the initiatives on the renewable side. They are testing all the tools in the toolbox in order to bring the country to a more renewable power generation and use other solutions. In Trinidad and Tobago, that for a long time has been the only major exporter of LNG on the Atlantic side of the Americas. Now the country is looking at other alternatives in order to support the development of Suriname and Guyana because of all the experience, local experience in offshore development. But there has been a flurry of new wells put on production, both onshore and offshore. So there is a combination of private investment there, but also the government is trying to support the industry, and they have launched a couple of bid rounds, and another bid round will be coming in 2023. All positive developments in the country. Here you see the president of Guyana visiting the prime minister of Trinidad in order to hold discussions about cooperation. If we go to Guyana, it's very difficult to miss. You probably heard a lot of stories and news and good things on Guyana. I would say that if you want to remember something on Guyana, only one thing, remember this: 1 FPSO per year. This has been an incredible development of the offshore natural resources in Guyana, and is bringing on production more and more wells every quarter. The country is also preparing a bid round, probably for 2023 and another one for 2024, in order to continue that virtuous circle of development. But it's also advancing in several other fronts, like bringing in natural gas from the offshore for a power plant. Onshore Guyana today is burning diesel and fuel oil for power generation, but also this will reduce the carbon footprint. Guyana is one of the 3 countries in Latin America that is a carbon sink, and they want to keep it that way. So another positive development is that Hess, the oil company from the US, they purchase carbon credits from the forest carbon sequestration in Guyana to the tune of $750 million. So this is something that you don't see very frequently in Latin America. Let's go to Suriname, where efforts continue in order to develop what they call the Golden Lane. And this is an important development because it's not only happening in Suriname. Brazil is also planning to drill some wells on the same regional geology in order to contribute to the development in that part of the country or in that part of the region. So stay tuned for more good news coming from Suriname, particularly on the gas production front. Suriname also conducted a bid round, and there will be a 2023 bid round next May. Here you see the map with all the wells already drilled in the offshore and the position of the blocks. A couple of them have been already assigned to international companies. If we go to the Andean region, Colombia, it continued to have a lot of news and discoveries and activity. In 2022, there has been a couple of very significant wells drilled in the deep water that could bring more natural gas production to the country. So this is something that the country will continue developing and trying to promote. There is a bid round for an LNG plant, regas facility on the Pacific coast that is coming at the end of March. So we hope that there will be very good news on that front as well. If we go to Ecuador, it's a country that has been attracting a lot of attention and foreign investment in the form of a couple of bid rounds. One that happened where at least 2 newcomers have already drilled wells and tested and started production. Frontera have several discoveries and is already exporting oil from Ecuador, and Gran Tierra is also testing significant wells, significant discoveries in the country. But the country is going through a bid round today that is called Intracampos 2. And I think that we have a picture here of the Vice President of Ecuador promoting the Intracampos 2 bid round in Houston at the end of the last year. The national oil company has press on the development of several fields, notably ITT, Spingo, Tombococha, Tiputini, on the Oriente Basin. And here we have the good results of some preliminary testing on some of these wells. If we go to Peru, you know that there has been a lot of political turmoil of late, but nevertheless, companies operating there have continued with their good work. And I always want to highlight what PetroTal is doing in the north of the country. This is a company that went from 0 to 20,000 barrels per day in a significant development of Block 95. And I think that I have here, they not only are exporting crude oil using the 2 pipelines that are connecting the block to the Pacific coast, but also they're exporting crude oil using barges through the Amazonian River. Something very, very imaginative that is providing other solutions in order to move crude oil from that part of Peru. I will only glimpse through Brazil because I assume that Carla is going to make some more meaningful remarks on the country. But if you need to remember only one thing about Brazil, remember this. This is a country that is producing today more than 4 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. It was 3.9 at the end of 2022, but now is 4.3, I believe. And the country is bound to produce more than 5 million barrels probably in a couple of years. Of that, 3 million barrels are from crude oil and 140 million cubic meters of natural gas production, which is also very significant. Let's go to Bolivia. Bolivia is a country that historically has been exporting natural gas to Brazil and to Argentina. But as you know, Brazil now has a lot of natural gas production that from the offshore that is bringing onshore with 3 pipelines that are under construction. And Argentina discovered Vaca Muerta. So the country is rethinking the long-term strategy. It's a country that not only has a lot of natural gas still, but also a lot of lithium. And so they are taking steps in order to reposition themselves on these 2 fronts. The national oil company is drilling, and I always like to show this picture because you don't see a drill bit of this size very frequently in Latin America. These are very deep wells, very complex wells that take sometimes more than a year to drill. But the national oil company YPFB is executing a very important exploration program. Argentina, we already mentioned Vaca Muerta. This is probably the most significant development. The country is building a couple of pipelines, one to transport natural gas from Vaca Muerta to Buenos Aires. But there are also has been several announcements in order to build additional pipelines in order to export gas to Brazil, to the south of Brazil, and even revert the pipeline that Argentina has been using to get natural gas from Bolivia to Argentina, revert the pipeline to ship gas from Argentina north. But there are also pipelines being built or being put back to production to transport crude oil. One of them, the Transandes pipeline that has the capacity of exporting more than 100,000 barrels of oil per day to Chile, and another expansion of an existing pipeline that is providing Argentina with an outlet to the Atlantic as well. Here we see the first section of the pipeline for the Vaca Muerta gas pipeline being built today. This has been built by Tenaris in Argentina. And the other development that is not very common in the south of Latin America is offshore. This is a vintage picture from 2021, but it's showing Shell, YPF, the national oil company, and Equinor signing an agreement to do exploration in the offshore that little by little is taking all the right steps. Very briefly, Uruguay is a country that is not producing crude oil or natural gas today, but they have a very successful program of offshore exploration. And actually, here you can see the seismic that is available in the offshore of Uruguay, and one well that was drilled in the past by Total Energies. They didn't have a discovery, but it's a very important data point from the technical point of view. But Uruguay is between 95 to 98% of renewable energy production, and is taking advantage of that incredible position in order to export renewable energy to their neighbors, or even planning or putting together plans in order to start producing methanol and sustainable aviation fuel and all that kind of solutions. I think I'm running out of time, so very quickly, Chile is very famous for all the attraction that they have got to produce hydrogen and derivatives of hydrogen, green hydrogen, in order to export that from the country to Asia Pacific and to Europe. And with that, back to you, Chris.
Right. Yeah, I see we're challenged on time, so just very quickly.
It's okay. That's okay. Yeah. We're good.
we'll talk a little bit about hydrogen as well. I think, if you talk to infrastructure investors globally, everyone's trying to connect the excitement around hydrogen with actual investment opportunities, because there aren't very many meaningful projects at scale yet. And some of that's tied to the expectation of having, a major hydrogen export economy, which is still somewhat challenged from an economics perspective. But there are several projects that are viable in terms of creating those regional hubs as part of decarbonization projects with a local use case. And that becomes important if you're thinking about, producing green or blue hydrogen and then fuel your petrochemical, steel, or manufacturing industries, because you'll be far more competitive once we start seeing carbon taxes at the border when you export those projects or products. And that's what Europe is facing in, for example, in the coming years with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we'll see reporting starting later this year, but it will be formally phased in starting in 2026. And from a regional perspective, of course, Latin America is already a major producer of hydrogen, but almost exclusively today it's unabated gray hydrogen. So translating those opportunities by combining them with storage and carbon capture would be an important component of it, and also, of course, leveraging the potential for renewable supporting green hydrogen production, like we've seen quite ambitious plans in Chile, for example. And so some of the countries with the greatest potential for hydrogen, like Chile, Argentina, and Mexico, are seeing some opportunities around that. The other thing that we could see happen from a local use case perspective as well is, of course, blending with natural gas, which could then support decarbonization at home and free up volumes for exports elsewhere. All right, geothermal. Many countries in the region have significant potential for geothermal power production as part of a decarbonization strategy. Even though geothermal is still very much a niche market from a global perspective, it's absolutely a key contributor to producing that low carbon baseload energy in many countries. And that's already the case in countries like Mexico, for example, which has an established geothermal industry with about 1 gigawatt of power production from geothermal today. However, we've also seen several smaller scale geothermal operations, some tied to co-production from vintage wells, or looking at ways to really reduce the carbon footprint of hydrocarbon production, like we've seen in Colombia with Parex, for example, and we know Ecopetrol is looking at that as well. Finally, a word on carbon capture and storage. we've entered a new phase of CCS projects in Europe and North America based on a new business model where we're really looking at storage as a service with hubs connected to major sources with multiple different proponents. And then, you couple that with subsidies and a price on carbon, which have been key to making projects a reality. In the US, a lot of that is tied to tax credits through the 45Q project or program that was strengthened through the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, that business model has not yet matured in LATAM, but it goes back to the original conversation we had around net zero targets. There are a few conceivable ways to get to net zero without CCS, and as the region starts to tackle this in earnest, it's gonna be part of the solution. There are some projects already, but most of that's re-injecting carbon for EUR, for example, in Brazil. But there's obviously a well-known geology in the region. So even though it's a relatively immature market, you have many of the preconditions in place. Coupled with that geology, you have many depleted wells, you have a concentration of sources that can also support a hub model in select markets. And I think we'll leave it there for now, and maybe back to you, Jeremy, and then Carla.
Wonderful. No, thank you very much, Chris. Those last points are particularly interesting to hear what you're talking about CCS. I mean, both hydrogen and CCS continue to have this moving from pilot to scale to commercial. So I definitely want to dig deeper into that. But first, let's invite excuse me, let's invite Carla to make some comments. And I want to go back particularly to something you said, Chris, at the very outset, and thanks also to Jorge for his wonderful tour de LATAM, high level, but every key point, and I appreciate that one thing to remember for sure. But Chris, you said, are we going to see greater integration or fragmentation? And this is something, Paul, that we've discussed at the Institute, and I know, Carla, we've traded some messages in our fellows chats. We've talked about this. So let me turn to you with that sort of context and invite you to make some comments.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thanks to Sproule as well for putting together this wonderful report. And thank you for the audience. I really appreciate you being here. I have the honor and I guess the luxury of also being here in Houston and having attended Sarah Week this week. So some of my comments may also be influenced by some of the learnings that are coming up through here. But to your point, Jeremy, I'm going to start there and then I'm going to digress to some other detailed comments and then come back to this point. But I think one of the reasons why it is becoming an opportunity for us in Latin America is the fact that there has been some changes in government in the last year and a half. And with these changes, it seems like many of them are now, I think, have more goodwill, if you will, to start looking at an integration within the region. But it's not easy. It's not easy, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But it's pretty well known that problems are solved if you can work together rather than individual companies working separately, countries working separately. So let me get back to that in a second. But some high-level comments here about Latin America. As I obviously throughout my career have been involved in defending investment opportunities in Latin America and more specifically Brazil, but really Latin America in a global context has the three pillars that we typically look at, right? It's got the markets, obviously some countries bigger than others. It has the resources, again, some countries more than others. And it has the human capital, right? The people behind having that entrepreneurial spirit and really wanting to make things happen. So now Latin America has been through ups and downs through time as we compete as well with other regions for investment opportunities. So dissecting maybe some of the three topics that Sproule identified this year, I think it was quite accurate on picking inflation as number one. I'm assuming that was a little bit of a ranking. Was that right, Chris? That was a little bit of a ranking. But inflation, because a region has been so impacted by hyperinflation in the past, we are very sensitive in Latin America to inflation. And inflation affects everybody because it affects governments, it affects investors, companies, and people down to the bottom line of how do I pay my electricity bill at the end of the month. So how countries manage inflation, and we know that Argentina is kind of a kind of standing alone there right now with respect to the level of inflation, but hopefully the region can sort of come to grips in managing that and not let it go out of control, which I think there's a good chance that things can stabilize. Natural gas, it's really interesting. 70% of the deals were natural gas. And one of the learnings coming out of the last year and a half is really natural gas is increasingly becoming called the transition energy, right? It's the fuel of transition because it displaces higher carbon fuels like high sulfur oil, like coal, and at least it transitions it to a lower carbon fuel to then transition it to something else at some point. So it's really encouraging to see the exchanges of deals in natural gas. Hopefully there'll be some increases in natural gas in the region. We still have some challenges because natural gas molecules are not easy to move around, to transport compared to oil. So interconnectivity in the region is a little harder because pipelines are expensive, and obviously manufacturing LNG is also fairly intensive in investment. But it's very, very encouraging, and the region, I think, has a really interesting future. And then I'd like to touch on oil production for the region. It was quite telling, I think, in the report on the production coming out of Brazil, particularly, and production coming out of Guyana. And those two countries are really putting forth the fact that the oil production, particularly the pre-salt in Brazil and Guyana, is really a barrel of oil that is being produced at a fairly low CO2 footprint. So that's also very encouraging for the region. And so I could see that becomes kind of a good selling point, if you will, for Latin America. Then I'd like to just make a few comments on the energy transition. My expectation is that countries that have endowments in oil and gas are likely to continue relying on the revenues coming from oil and gas to really build a revenue base, to start really building plans and investments in transition fuels of the future. And so there's a little bit of, will they get to this net zero so quickly? It just depends on the country, because each country has its own plan and one size doesn't fit all. So a plan for Brazil would be different than a plan for Chile, than a plan for Colombia. But I am expecting that those countries that aren't endowed with oil and gas, like Chile, is going to jump very quickly to looking at renewables and low carbon fuels for the future and for now, because they really don't have the luxury of doing anything else. And so I think we're starting to see the regulatory frameworks evolving to really facilitate, in the case of Chile, facilitate this energy transition in a faster way. And then some other countries, it may lag a bit. You know, Brazil still has to finish its natural gas legislation. Overall, on the sort of a general comment, carbon pricing legislation is still something that needs to be really looked at for the region. And so for the energy transition, I expect some countries to be a little further ahead, some countries to be further behind. And then a few comments on Brazil. Brazil is really, obviously, a country that's endowed with natural resources for renewables, as hydro, offshore wind, solar as well, and obviously oil and gas. So it has one of the cleanest energy matrices in the world, and it would like to stay that way. And so a substantial amount of Brazil's production, some of it will be consumed internally, some of it will be exported. But I see a couple of things evolving for Brazil this year. The role of Petrobras. Petrobras is now under new management with the change in government going to President Lula. And so under the direction of the new president, Jean-Paul Prats, I think he is seeing Petrobras also can utilize some of the core competencies that it has developed in its existence, like, you know, a lot of offshore experience. And so take some of those core competencies and step into the transition, the energy transition activities that make sense. So you probably just heard of some announcements of investments in offshore wind, for example. So I suspect that we're going to be seeing a slight, not that Petrobras is going to change its core competencies, it's not, or its core business, but it will add on some new types of businesses geared towards energy transition. And then the second thing about Brazil, and you touched on it, is the fact that there's a new frontier out there, which is the equatorial margin. It's an unknown. It's also very attractive from a standpoint of if there is a geologic analog with Guyana just to the north, it could be really a new frontier. So as the pre-salt developments become clearer in terms of the sizes of the fields, it's probably the large fields in the pre-salt have already been discovered. So now it may be smaller fields. And so really Brazil is kind of looking to that equatorial margin as a potential area of investment. So now I come back to where I began, which was, the tripod of resource, markets, and human capital for Latin America. And really, as I look at the Latin America as a whole, Latin America has a tremendous opportunity going forward, because on the resource side, not only do we have oil and gas, but we have all of the renewables. We have a huge rainforest in the Amazon for carbon offsets, as an example. We've got a region that has the critical minerals that are also needed for this energy transition. So looking at rainforests, critical minerals, oil and gas, wind, solar, the markets that are really needing this, as well as the people that are behind it, it's a really great way to look at Latin America from an integrated basis, provided we have cooperation and provided we have some thoughtful policies put in place. So those are some of my comments. I thank you.
No, thank you very much, Carla. Very optimistic, and I appreciate the optimism. And you also hit on something I think is hugely important, right? Because it's been a debate over the last couple of years: natural gas, transition fuel, and it's reemerged. And I think we can all agree that the energy security aspect, and where natural gas and perhaps LNG, when we talk about Europe, is really fundamental. So this role of gas, not only as an energy transition, but in sort of that guarantor of near-term energy security, I think is hugely important. We can debate the lower carbon aspect, but I think at least for now, we're balancing energy transition with energy security, and gas clearly continues to be a key part of that. And as Jorge went through the region, it's such a fundamental in so many key markets. And I think, again, not all barrels are the same, right? I mean, this is the key point. The pre-salt barrels are, as the Brazilians are very proud to claim, lower carbon barrels, right?
Yes.
So the lowering of the carbon footprint, I think all of these are hugely important points. But let's move to the poll, and then let's get some audience questions. So following Carla's optimistic and wonderful assessment, and Jorge and Chris's summation of their report, which we'll give you all and post that in the chat here in a minute for download, as well as when we share the recording. We want to hear from you as to where you, the audience, are looking this year in a question that we're calling, what's the most attractive market? So hopefully popping up on your screen right now, and thanks to Gianna for her help in getting this ready yesterday. All right, you're weighing in, so you can see it. This is wonderful. All right, so I'll leave that open. We'll come back to that at the end. Let's get into some audience questions here. But let me go back first to you, Chris, because I do like this question of greater integration or fragmentation. So back to you. What's it going to be? You're muted. Sorry. The audio, we can't hear you for some reason. No. Well, Jorge, you're going to have to, sorry, Chris. Jorge, can you jump in while we, yeah.
I can take the question. So the short answer is yes. So basically, there will be integration and fragmentation, as Carla pointed out.
It's not a yes or no yet. That's at the end.
But no, seriously, I think that the region has a lot of disparities. So there will be some opportunities for additional integration. And just, I think last week, there was an important agreement between Mexico and a couple of countries in Central America in order to seek for more integration in the region. And we have seen several other examples of, it was mentioned here, countries that are looking at reducing their hydrocarbons consumption in order to increase exporting. And that also provides an opportunity for integration within the region. So I don't think that there is only one answer. It will be on a case by case. There is very good opportunities still to be captured. And one example is Bolivia with Peru and Bolivia with Chile. I know that there has been several discussions ongoing. So this is great. It's part of the very good dynamic in Latin America. There is still so much to be done that there are very good opportunities still to be captured. So I think that financing is one of the key issues here when you talk about the integration between two countries, because these are massive infrastructure facilities that you have to put in place. And there are, the private investment is stepping on, but in other cases, like the case of this Vaca Muerta pipeline in Argentina, the governments have to take the lead.
Well, you obviously saw the question we received from the audience.
No, not yet.
It was a specific question about whether the Vaca Muerta pipeline, this is a pipeline that would connect, the large bonanza of natural gas from Argentina with Brazil, or sort of reinforce legacy integration of gas markets. The question was quite directly, is that pipeline between Argentina and Brazil realistic? And maybe Jorge first, and then Carla, I'd like your thoughts on that as well.
Well, this is something that has been on discussion for a long time. And there is actually a pipeline already between Brazil and Argentina that hasn't been used a lot. So when you look at the array of pipelines connecting Brazil internally, there is not a very good connection to the south of Brazil. So I think that there is an opportunity for that, but also providing natural gas from Argentina and Bolivia through a major trunk pipeline that is already built. It's a pipeline that is connecting the two countries and can ship more than 30 million cubic meters per day. And today is only half utilized.
Let me add to it, Carla. Thank you, Jorge. Carla, when you respond, because part of the question that somebody posted was regarding BNDES financing, because I think somewhere along the way, Lula or somebody from Brazil, it was mentioned this pipeline, Argentina, Brazil, could also receive some BNDES financing. So both those points, if you don't mind.
Sure. No, I think Jorge hit it spot on that there really isn't a lot of infrastructure connecting the south of Brazil into kind of the rest of it. Now, having said that, there's quite a bit of gas demand in the south of Brazil that's probably unmet as well. So it's the south of Brazil is also harder to be supplied by natural gas, say, coming from the pre-salt or other oil and gas producing regions. I think the framework is in place for this pipeline to move forward, especially if there's political will on both sides. With respect to BNDES financing, I'm sorry, I can't opine if it is going to work or not going to work. But obviously, if it is a benefit to Brazil, then BNDES certainly, it makes sense that BNDES weighs in. And it's also a mechanism that Lula probably wants to reach out to his neighbor and show kind of more regional integration. But I suspect that it will depend on how this project ranks with other projects that BNDES is also evaluating.
Perfect. Yeah, no, thank you. Chris, let's see. Welcome back. Sorry about that. Fragmentation, integration, you want to try?
Well, I guess I missed the earlier comments, but
that's okay.
I mean, I think if anything, greater integration is going to benefit the region because it just creates, more sustainable, leveraging of comparative advantages across the region. And I think where you've lacked it in the past has been because you've not necessarily seen, an alignment in terms of policy relative to, kind of the long-term vision that's needed to accomplish that. But I would say that even just the fact that, whether you believe this is actually ever going to happen or not, the fact that you have Argentina and Brazil discussing a common currency, for example, is a positive sign because it at a minimum, signals an interest and opportunity to consider greater integration. And I think where this is going to be important too is if you think about how supply chains are going to become more bifurcated or decoupled in the future between, kind of a US-led Western supply chain relative to China. Latin America needs to really think about its regional strength to navigate that, because clearly it has interest in maintaining a good connection to both.
I think there's a lot to discuss at a broader level, and we get into questions. And you brought up the Inflation Reduction Act, and where does that fit vis-a-vis the U.S. Countering China and with free trade agreements that it has with certain countries in the region. That probably is an entirely different webinar. Let me ask something. There's a question about flaring that's particularly related to Brazil. Like how the question was, of the gas that's being produced in the pre-salt, how much is being flared? But let's take that and actually look at the whole region, because you talked, I think, Jorge, about Venezuela flaring. And so a question maybe, Jorge, to start, and Carla, if you want to jump in as well on the Brazil part, but this issue of flaring, because I think if we're honest with ourselves about natural gas as a transition fuel, we need to address in a major substantive way flaring and methane leaks and capture. So Jorge, talk a little bit about flaring. I mean, what can be done, and how much gas is the region actually losing because of it?
Well, yeah, flaring is an issue overall Latin America. We already mentioned Venezuela, but when I mentioned 140 million cubic meters per day of natural gas production offshore in Brazil, actually only less than 40 millions are getting to the market. The other 100 millions is not that it's flaring, it's getting reinjected in offshore. So the part of the development of infrastructure in Brazil is connecting the offshore to the coast, to the onshore, in order to put this production into the market. And this is a very significant development for Brazil, but also for Bolivia, because obviously Bolivia will have less chances of selling natural gas to Brazil to the tune of what has been happening in the last 10 years. Then in other gas-producing countries in the region, notably Trinidad, there is not much flaring there. So that is not a problem. There are some flaring in Peru, but I would say minimum, and is not an issue in Argentina. So I would say that the two focus are capturing this gas that is actually burned or flare in Venezuela, or actually putting into the market
Mexico.
these 100 million cubic meters per day in Brazil. The other to that point as well, I'm trying to connect the dots here. Brazil is the first country that is testing separation offshore of CO2, and Petrobras is putting in place a project that is called HICEP, where the CO2 is getting separated at the FPSO level and then reinjected back into the reservoir, which is a very, very good example of CCUS application in Latin America.
Carla, please. Thanks, Jorge.
Sure. Yeah, what I could say certainly about the Brazilian natural gas sector is it's not an easy solution, and there's the fact that quite a bit of the gas is reinjected, but it also increases oil production, which has a benefit to, say, Brazilian society and government because of the increase in revenues from royalties. There are billions of reais of royalties that come from the production of oil as well. So there's that aspect of maintaining that oil production, which is important, but it's really the issue of, it's not the fact that gas can't be supplied, and the fact that there is no market for it. It's what happens in between. It's the connecting. Offshore gas pipelines aren't cheap. They're expensive. They're hard to permit. And so the complexities of the connecting between offshore and onshore and the markets is not trivial, and that's the biggest thing that needs to be solved. Some of it is getting solved. I mean, there are new routes that are being developed, but it's a very large area to cover.
No, thank you. And David, thanks for your comment in the chat or in the Q&A about Mexico. Absolutely. I mean, we see report after report of Pemex flaring and lack of compliance with regulations there on the flaring front. We're running out of time, and I want to get to the poll, but Chris, there's a question I think is important. Let's wrap up with this because it is a fundamental issue, and we can call it the social license to operate. The question was specific to the community issues that the whole sector, whether we're talking about all range of the energy sector. Address a little bit about the community issue and that social license to operate. I know it's a very broad, so take a minute and do that, but it's important.
Well, it is important because, you need to have that buy-in, but I think it starts really at the, again, at the policy level. You need to kind of create that vision for the country and the policies that follow that, where community relations are obviously part and parcel of it. And I think if you can communicate the benefits around it in terms of jobs and economic prosperity, electrification and energy access as key kind of tenets of that, I think you're going to be in a much better position to deal with it. Because in many ways, what we've seen in many countries, including in Canada, is, proponents of projects have put money towards trying to resolve those issues. That is not a long-term sustainable way to deal with it. You really need to bring the communities along with, a pathway towards prosperity and long-term benefits to make it part and parcel of what you're creating.
Yes, no, it's, I think, Carla, you mentioned, the opportunity for critical minerals. And I think right now in Chile, it's a huge debate. And we see even in parts of Mexico, one of the questions around this everyone's celebrating the Tesla announcement. However, the issue of water and how water will be managed, fundamental to this entire debate and discussion. We're out of time. Let me end the poll. Okay, let's see. Share results. I think everyone should hopefully see on their screen. Well, we've got a Brazil crowd today, I guess. Huh?
I tell you, I did not vote just to keep the poll completely objective.
All right. Well, that's okay. Well, that would have been 14 then, I take it. Yeah. So look, it's 10 o'clock here in California. I want to thank Diana Rodriguez for all her help on the webinar. You just see her photo there, but she's making this all work, and Nicole Ronsky at Sproule for her support and lead up. Thank you to Sproule, Jorge Milanese, and Chris Milda, and of course my colleague, the non-resident fellow here at the Institute, Carla Lacerda. So the yes and no question to finalize our wrap up our webinar today, we'll go with this. Are the responses here? Let's put it this way. Is the audience correct? Yes or no? Jorge?
Yes.
Okay. Chris?
Yes.
Carla?
Yes, I would say yes.
All of you. All right. Well, I'm gonna be like John McLaughlin back in the day in the famous McLaughlin group in Washington. Wrong. The answer is no. So no, I think some people probably would argue depends on the segment of the energy sector, right? But that's okay.
Yeah, and I would say, Jeremy, if I may
Yeah,
interrupt,
please.
it will
Please.
also depend on how investors view risk. Right.
Managing risk.
I think that's, yes, I was I am very optimistic, but that aspect of it really needs to be thought through on how, and some investors are more tolerant, others are less
Sure.
tolerant, right? But management of risk is going to be really key for really to determine if some of these projects are really going to go forward or some of them not.
Perfect place to leave it. Thank you all. We'll be sharing the recording, the PowerPoint, and I think, Diana, thanks for posting the link to the report in the chat. Have a wonderful weekend. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. Good to see
Bye,
you all.
Everyone.
Thank you.